If you are a refugee living in the United States right now, this ruling could directly impact your future, because a federal judge has just stepped in and blocked immigration authorities from arresting and detaining certain refugees, and this decision is already sending shockwaves through the national immigration system. Tonight, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why the court intervened, and what this means for refugee families not just in Minnesota, but potentially across the country. In a significant legal development, a U.S. district judge issued an order temporarily preventing immigration enforcement actions against specific refugee groups, stating that authorities must follow strict legal standards before detaining individuals who were lawfully admitted into the United States under official refugee status. Now, this is important. Refugees are not undocumented entrants. They go through one of the most rigorous screening processes in the world. Background checks, security clearances, biometric verification, interviews, all completed before they ever step foot on American soil. That legal admission process gives them protected status under federal immigration law. According to court documents, attorneys representing refugee families argued that recent enforcement actions were creating fear and uncertainty inside legally admitted communities. They claimed that some detentions lacked individualized legal justification and did not fully respect due process protections guaranteed under the Constitution. The judge reviewed those arguments and concluded that immigration authorities cannot broadly detain refugees without demonstrating clear statutory authority tied to each specific case. In other words, enforcement cannot operate on generalized assumptions. It must be legally grounded, case by case. This ruling does not eliminate immigration enforcement. It does not change federal refugee law. And it does not grant permanent immunity. What it does is reinforce a core principle of the American legal system. Government power must operate within defined legal boundaries. Legal experts say this decision highlights the balance between national security enforcement and constitutional protections. While immigration agencies maintain broad authority, courts serve as a check to ensure that authority is exercised properly. For refugee families in Minnesota, the immediate impact is temporary protection from the challenged enforcement measures. But because this is a developing case, the federal government still has the option to appeal, which means the situation could evolve quickly depending on how higher courts respond. And that raises an even bigger question about how immigration enforcement policies are being interpreted in 2026, especially as political debate intensifies nationwide. And that broader national context is exactly where this story becomes even more important. Because immigration enforcement in the United States has always existed at the intersection of law, policy, and politics. And when a federal judge steps in like this, it signals that something significant is unfolding beneath the surface. Over the past year, enforcement priorities have shifted in different regions, with agencies focusing on compliance reviews, status verification, and monitoring of humanitarian admission programs. Refugees, by definition, are individuals who were granted protection after demonstrating credible fear of persecution in their home countries. Their admission is not random. It is structured, documented, and approved at the highest federal levels. That is why this ruling carries weight beyond just one state. When the court emphasized that enforcement actions must be tied to individualized legal authority, it reinforced the idea that refugee status is not symbolic. It carries measurable legal protections. Immigration attorneys following the case say one of the central issues was whether authorities were applying broad enforcement directives in situations that required more specific legal findings. In federal court, precision matters. Agencies must show that each action aligns with statutory language passed by Congress. The judge's order essentially pauses certain enforcement practices while the court continues to examine whether they comply with federal immigration law. This type of judicial pause is designed to prevent potential harm while legal arguments are fully reviewed. It does not determine the final outcome, but it does establish temporary boundaries. Nationally, refugee communities have been watching closely. Many families entered the United States after fleeing conflict zones, political repression, or severe humanitarian crises. After years of vetting and waiting, stability is often their top priority. Legal uncertainty can create deep anxiety, especially when enforcement activity increases. Policy analysts point out that the refugee program has historically involved coordination between multiple federal departments, including Homeland Security and diplomatic agencies. Because of that interagency structure, enforcement questions can become legally complex very quickly. When courts intervene, they are often clarifying how those interlocking authorities must operate together. Another layer to consider is the constitutional dimension. Even though immigration law grants broad federal power, non-citizens who are lawfully present still have rights under the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Courts have repeatedly affirmed that lawful status cannot be ignored during enforcement decisions. At the same time, federal officials may argue that immigration agencies must retain operational flexibility to address compliance concerns or security reviews. That tension between flexibility and legal restraint is not new. It has defined immigration debates for decades. What makes this moment different is the timing. With immigration consistently ranking among the top national issues, every court ruling becomes part of a larger conversation about the future direction of U.S. policy. Some see judicial oversight as essential protection. Others see it as a limitation on executive authority. Both perspectives are shaping public discussion. And as this legal battle continues, the next critical question becomes whether this ruling could influence enforcement strategies outside Minnesota, especially if higher courts decide to weigh in. Because if a higher court decides to review this order, the outcome could either reinforce these temporary protections or redefine how refugee enforcement is handled at a broader federal level. When cases like this move to appellate courts, judges do not simply reconsider the facts. They examine whether the lower court correctly interpreted federal statutes and constitutional principles. That means the debate could shift from individual enforcement actions to the legal framework that governs refugee protections nationwide. Immigration policy in the United States is shaped by three branches of government. Congress writes the laws, the executive branch enforces them, and the judiciary interprets whether those laws are being applied properly. This ruling represents that third branch stepping in to review how enforcement authority is being exercised. Some legal scholars believe this case could clarify how refugee status interacts with detention authority under existing immigration statutes. Refugee admission is authorized under specific sections of federal law, and once admitted, individuals are granted legal standing that differs from other categories. The court's emphasis on individualized legal grounds suggests that refugee status cannot be treated as a temporary privilege without procedural safeguards. For refugee families, the practical question is stability. Many have already gone through years of uncertainty before reaching the United States. The possibility of detention despite lawful admission creates confusion about long-term security. The judge's order temporarily reduces that uncertainty, at least while the case remains under review. Meanwhile, federal officials are likely evaluating their legal options. An appeal could lead to a stay request, meaning enforcement policies might resume depending on how quickly higher courts act. Timing matters in these situations, and legal processes can move rapidly when national attention is involved. It's also important to understand that this case does not exist in isolation. Across the country, immigration courts and federal district courts are currently handling cases involving asylum processing timelines, border enforcement authority, visa restrictions, and humanitarian protections. Each ruling contributes to the evolving interpretation of immigration law in 2026. Public reaction has been divided. Supporters of the ruling argue that it reinforces the principle that lawful status must be respected and that due process applies to everyone physically present under legal admission. Critics argue that enforcement agencies need broader discretion to respond to changing compliance concerns. These competing views reflect the broader national debate over how to balance compassion and control within the immigration system. As the legal arguments continue, what remains clear is that the courts are playing a central role in defining how immigration enforcement operates in real time, and that ongoing judicial involvement may shape the next phase of refugee policy discussions across the United States. Especially as lawmakers continue debating broader immigration reforms heading into the next legislative session. One of the larger questions now is whether this ruling signals a shift in how courts will approach enforcement oversight moving forward. In recent years, federal judges have increasingly scrutinized immigration directives to ensure they align precisely with statutory language. When courts pause enforcement actions, they are not necessarily rejecting policy goals. They are evaluating whether the implementation follows the law as written. For immigration agencies, this creates a legal checkpoint. Policies must be carefully structured, clearly justified, and individually applied. Broad enforcement approaches can face challenges if they appear to bypass procedural safeguards. That is why documentation, case review standards, and individualized assessments become central in courtroom arguments. Refugee advocacy organizations say this case highlights the vulnerability many families feel even after lawful admission. While refugee status provides protection, It does not automatically eliminate future legal reviews. However, what the court emphasized here is that any review must be legally supported and procedurally fair. From a policy standpoint, decisions like this can influence internal agency guidance. Even temporary rulings sometimes prompt departments to clarify enforcement memos or adjust operational language to reduce future legal exposure. That means the ripple effects of this order could extend beyond Minnesota, shaping administrative procedures nationwide. At the same time, immigration remains a politically charged issue. Federal officials must balance border management, humanitarian commitments, and public safety considerations, all while staying within constitutional limits. Courts serve as referees in that balancing act, ensuring that executive authority does not exceed statutory boundaries. If the case advances to a higher court, judges may examine prior Supreme Court precedents involving detention authority and lawful presence. Past rulings have consistently stated that while Congress grants significant immigration power to the executive branch, constitutional protections still apply to those who are lawfully admitted. For viewers trying to understand the big picture, the most important takeaway is this. The ruling reinforces legal limits on refugee detention practices, establishes temporary protections while litigation continues, and underscores the role of federal courts in reviewing immigration enforcement actions. It does not end enforcement authority, but it does require that authority to be exercised carefully and lawfully. As developments continue, additional filings, appeals, or clarifications could emerge quickly. Immigration law evolves not just through new legislation, but through judicial interpretation and executive implementation. This case represents one moment in that larger, ongoing legal process, a process that will likely continue shaping the direction of U.S. refugee policy in the months ahead. We will continue monitoring this situation closely and bring you updates as soon as new legal movements occur, because in the current immigration climate, court decisions like this can redefine enforcement practices faster than many expect. Especially when higher courts begin reviewing the legal boundaries of executive authority. Looking ahead, the next major development to watch will be whether federal attorneys file an appeal. If they do, the appellate court could either uphold the temporary protections, narrow them, or lift them altogether. That decision would not only affect Minnesota, but could influence how refugee enforcement policies are interpreted across multiple states. For refugee families, the practical reality right now is cautious relief. The court's order provides breathing room, but it does not eliminate long-term legal review. Immigration law operates within a layered system, and each layer, agency policy, district court rulings, appellate review, adds complexity to the outcome. This case also reinforces something broader about the American legal system. Immigration authority is powerful, but it is not unlimited. Courts exist to interpret whether that authority is being applied within constitutional and statutory limits. That balance between enforcement and legal restraint is central to how the U.S. system functions. As policymakers continue debating border security, humanitarian protections, and enforcement priorities in 2026, judicial oversight will remain a critical factor. Every ruling contributes to shaping how immigration law evolves in practice, not just on paper. For viewers trying to understand what this means today, here's the bottom line. The federal court has temporarily blocked certain refugee detention actions in Minnesota, reinforcing due process protections while the legal challenge continues. The situation remains active, and additional updates could emerge quickly depending on appeals or further judicial review. Immigration policy is constantly evolving, and staying informed is essential, especially when court decisions directly affect legally admitted communities. We'll continue following this case closely and provide clear, fact-based updates as new information becomes available, because in a rapidly changing immigration landscape, timely and accurate reporting makes all the difference. Stay informed, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next update.